I was walking through the park the other day when I saw this man accidentally bump into a woman carrying groceries, her apples scattered everywhere. He just kept walking, didn't even glance back, and watching her kneel down to collect those rolling apples while he disappeared into the crowd, I thought about Jung's work with patients who simply couldn't say, "I'm sorry." You know what's haunting about this? It's not that these people are necessarily malicious. Jung discovered something far more unsettling. They genuinely can't see their own role in what happened. It's like they're living in a different movie than everyone else. Maybe you've met someone like this. They hurt your feelings, damage your trust, or create chaos in a room. And when you bring it up, they look at you with this blank confusion. What are you talking about? I didn't do anything wrong. And the scary part? They mean it. Jung called this the shadow, those parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. But in people who never apologize, something more complex is happening. It's not just that they won't look at their shadow. They've constructed an entire psychological fortress to keep it invisible, even to themselves. I remember Jung writing about a 45-year-old patient who told him, "But I can never admit to myself that I've wasted the best 25 years of my life." That resistance, that absolute refusal to admit fault, wasn't just stubbornness, it was survival. For some people, seeing their mistakes feels like psychological death. Think about the last time you tried to get an apology from someone who never gives them. How did it feel? Probably like talking to a wall, right? Like your words just bounced off them. Jung would say that's because you're not actually talking to them. You're talking to their projection. Here's where it gets really twisted. These people don't just refuse to see their own faults. They literally can't see them. Jung discovered that what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, we automatically project onto others. So the person who can never apologize becomes convinced that everyone else is the problem. The world becomes a mirror, reflecting their own unacknowledged shadow back at them, but they see it as coming from outside. I've watched this happen in relationships. The partner who never apologizes starts genuinely believing their spouse is overly sensitive, too demanding, always starting fights. They're not lying. They've created a reality where they're the victim and everyone else is unreasonable. Jung called this the projection-making factor, and once it takes hold, it has a life of its own. The woman in my life once told me about her ex-husband who couldn't apologize for anything, not for forgetting her birthday, not for the harsh words, not even for the time he backed into her car in their own driveway. She said it was like being married to someone who lived in a parallel universe, where nothing was ever his fault. The groceries were in the wrong place. She was standing behind the car where she shouldn't have been. Her expectations were unrealistic. What struck me about her story was how she started questioning her own reality. When you're constantly told that your hurt feelings are your own problem, that you're too sensitive, that you're remembering things wrong, you begin to doubt yourself. Jung saw this too, how the person who can't apologize doesn't just refuse accountability, they make accountability impossible by rewriting the very fabric of what happened. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. This isn't really about arrogance or narcissism, though it might look like that from the outside. It's about terror. These people have learned, usually very early, that admitting fault leads to catastrophic consequences. Maybe they had a parent who exploded at any sign of imperfection. Maybe they grew up in an environment where showing weakness meant being destroyed. So they built this psychological armor that says, "I'm always right," because the alternative, being wrong, being flawed, being human, feels like annihilation. The irony is that in trying to protect themselves from the pain of being wrong, they've made it impossible to actually connect with other people. I think about Jung's patient who was convinced everyone was against him. 25 years of blaming the world, 25 years of missed opportunities for real intimacy and growth, all because he couldn't bear to look at his own contribution to his suffering. Jung wrote, "It is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much the whole tragedy originates in himself." Maybe you've felt this too. That frustration of watching someone destroy relationships, burn bridges, create chaos, all while maintaining this ironclad certainty that they're the victim in every story. They're not evil, they're terrified, but their terror has consequences for everyone around them. And here's the really painful part. The people in their lives start walking on eggshells, not because these individuals are actively threatening, but because any challenge to their worldview feels like an attack to them. You learn not to bring up problems because you know it will somehow become your fault. You start apologizing for things that aren't your responsibility just to keep the peace. Jung saw how this dynamic creates what he called an autoerotic condition. These people become trapped in a world of their own making, where everything confirms their pre-existing beliefs about who's right and who's wrong. They lose the capacity for real relationships because real relationships require the ability to say, I was wrong, sometimes. I wonder if you've ever been in that position, either as the person who couldn't apologize or as someone loving them. It's exhausting either way. Being unable to apologize is like carrying a backpack full of stones that just keeps getting heavier. Every unacknowledged hurt, every unrepaired relationship, every bridge burned in the name of being right, they all pile up. But for the people trying to love someone who can't apologize, it's like being slowly erased. Your feelings don't count. Your experience gets rewritten. Your reality becomes secondary to their need to remain blameless. And that's its own kind of psychological violence, isn't it? Jung believed that integration of the shadow, acknowledging our dark and flawed aspects, was essential for psychological health. He said, to become conscious of the shadow involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge. But what about people for whom this feels impossible? What about those who learned that being wrong meant being worthless? Jung worked with patients who had built such elaborate defenses that even in therapy, they couldn't admit fault without feeling like they were dying inside. I remember reading about one of his cases, a man who would literally become physically ill when confronted with evidence of his mistakes. His body would react as if he were under mortal threat, because psychologically, he was. His entire sense of self was built on the foundation of being right, and any crack in that foundation threatened to bring the whole structure down. There's something almost tragic about watching this from the outside. These people often end up alone, not because they're unlovable, but because they've made love conditional on everyone else's willingness to accept blame for everything that goes wrong. They've turned relationships into courtrooms, where they're always the judge and never the defendant. And yet I find myself wondering about compassion here, because if you really understand what Jung was saying about the shadow, then you realize that the people who can never apologize are often the ones who most desperately need to be forgiven for something. Usually something they did to themselves long ago, failing to meet impossible standards, disappointing someone whose love felt conditional, or simply being human in a world that taught them human was not enough. Maybe the question isn't how to make these people apologize. Maybe it's how to help them feel safe enough to be wrong. Because in Jung's view, the inability to apologize isn't really about pride. It's about survival. It's about having learned that admitting fault leads to abandonment, shame, or psychological annihilation. But here's what Jung also knew. As long as we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, it owns us. The person who can never say, I'm sorry, is not free. They're enslaved to an image of perfection that doesn't exist. They've traded authenticity for the illusion of safety. And in doing so, they've made real safety impossible. I think about that man in the park again, walking away from those scattered apples. What was he walking away from, really? The inconvenience of helping? The embarrassment of acknowledging his mistake? Or something deeper, the unbearable weight of being human in a world that taught him human wasn't enough? Jung spent his life studying the ways we avoid ourselves, and he found that the people who seem most offended are often the most wounded. The person who can never apologize may be carrying some ancient hurt that taught them that being wrong equals being worthless. They're not refusing to apologize. They're refusing to die. But the cruel irony is that in trying to avoid that psychological death, they're missing out on psychological life. Real intimacy requires vulnerability. Love requires the ability to say, I hurt you, and I'm sorry. Growth requires admitting we don't have it all figured out. So when you encounter someone who can never apologize, maybe see if you can glimpse the frightened child beneath all that armor. Not to excuse the behavior, the impact on others is real and often devastating. But to understand that healing this pattern requires addressing the original wound that made apologizing feel so dangerous in the first place. And if you recognize yourself in this description, If you're watching this and thinking about all the times you've walked away from scattered apples, Jung would probably say the first step is just noticing, just seeing the pattern without immediately defending it or explaining it away. That noticing, that simple awareness, is the beginning of what he called individuation, the long, difficult, necessary process of becoming whole. We don't become perfect by never being wrong. We become human by learning to acknowledge our imperfections with grace. The strongest people aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who can get back up, dust themselves off, and say, I'm sorry, when they've knocked someone else down in the process. Maybe you felt this too. That moment when you realize that being right all the time is lonelier than being wrong and connected. That pride is colder than humility. That I'm sorry isn't about losing. It's about loving. And I still don't know what to do with that man who walked away from the scattered apples. Part of me wants to shake him, to make him see what he left behind. But another part wonders what he was carrying that made stopping feel so impossible. What old wound was he protecting? What childhood voice was telling him that helping would cost more than he could afford to pay? Jung believed that consciousness was the cure for most of our psychological suffering. Not the consciousness of being right, but the consciousness of being whole, shadow and light, right and wrong, human and trying to be better. The person who can never apologize has split themselves in half, keeping only the acceptable parts and projecting the rest onto everyone else. But wholeness requires owning all of it, the good intentions and the careless moments, the love and the harm, the desire to help and the times we walk away. Jung called this individuation, and he believed it was the most important work we could do, not just for ourselves, but for everyone whose lives we touch. So here's my question for you, and it's the same question Jung might have asked. What are you walking away from? What scattered apples have you left for someone else to pick up? And what would it cost you, really cost you, to turn around and help gather them up? Because maybe that's where healing begins. Not in being perfect, but in being present. Not in never making mistakes, but in making amends. Not in being right about everything, but in being real about our impact on the world around us. The apology isn't just words. It's an act of courage. It's saying, I see you. I see the impact of my actions, and your experience matters to me. For someone who learned early that being wrong meant being worthless, that might be the most radical act of all. Choosing connection over protection, truth over safety, love over the desperate need to be right. And I wonder if that's what Jung meant when he talked about the shadow containing the seed of transformation, that the very thing we're most afraid to acknowledge might be the doorway to becoming who we're meant to be. Not perfect, but whole. Not right about everything, but real about what matters most.